I can't believe it. I just checked my spreadsheet and I realized that I've made more than 156 quilts in my lifetime so far. That number just keeps growing all the time, so it's hard for me to just remember because it's changing all the time. But 156 quilts is how many I've made so far, and I've learned a lot of life lessons out of that. And I thought I'd just share with you the life lessons that I've learned from making the number of quilts that I have made. So one thing I've learned is I've been thinking about the journey it takes to go from beginner to expert. So imagine a child who's been given some fabric just to play with, and whatever quilt that this child makes without the education, without the directions on how to make the quilt, without the experience of having seen many other quilts before, without the proper eye-hand coordination it takes to make a quilt, that beginner child, whatever project that they've made, it'll still be a nice project as a memory. You know, you'll say, oh, bless your heart when you see that quilt. But it's not going to be anything that's somebody who wins a blue ribbon at a quilt show, maybe even the best of show winners or the Quilters Hall of Fame. I mean, there's a big long path to get from here to there. And for the longest time, I was thinking about it as one big path. It would just be one big path that you would go from beginner to expert. Well, first of all, before I'm moving my hand up, but it's really not a steep climb. There's not a steep learning curve in quilting. It's actually a long path, and as long as you keep walking or driving on this path, you'll be fine. You'll be able to get to the other side, at least from where I am now, from the angle that I'm looking at. It doesn't look to me like a steep learning curve. There are some hurdles that you have to go through. At the beginning, you have to go through the hurdles of learning how to cut with a rotary cutter, and you'd have to learn how to sew and how to nest seams, that sort of thing. And then there's the applique hurdle that a lot of people go through. I did. The dreaded A word was something that I definitely had to go through. There's a free motion quilting hurdle that some people had to go through. I had to go through that as well. There's a paper piecing hurdle, which I haven't still gone over yet. But there are things that you would have to learn along the way. And what I've found so far, at least with the applique and with the free motion quilting, it's not a difficult hurdle. It's about the mental mindset. If you just take one thing, one step at a time, you'll be fine with it. It's just a matter of overcoming your own roadblocks to it. It's once I got out of my own head and just took one step at a time, I was easily able to overcome that obstacle. And once I did, it was like a whole new world had opened to me. And the freedom of being able to applique and the freedom of being able to do free motion quilting, and both of those things are just so much fun for me that I'm glad that I was able to get over those hurdles. So it's one thing, I guess, is that teaches you is that you have to be willing to make mistakes, get out of your head, and be able to just do the work and take chances to try things out. So that's a lesson that, you can't learn something if you aren't willing to make mistakes about it. And to me, you have to be willing to make that effort to get past that hurdle. It's that persistence and that willingness to try new things and the willingness to make mistakes that really helps you advance in life and get you to the goal of becoming an expert quilter. But the other thing that I also learned about this quilting road is that it's not one single road. It's actually multiple lanes. Because in order to become a Hall of Fame quilter, you can be in the education field or you can do something else. There are so many different ways you can get from beginner quilter to wherever advanced expert that you want to be. There are many lanes. So you could do the modern quilting, the traditional, the applique, you could do teaching, you could do charity work. There's just a lot of different ways that you can choose to quilt. And for me, I've been going back and forth this way instead of going straight because I like a large variety of quilts and a large variety of things. I go a lot of zigzaggy ways, and I do feel like I am progressing at some point, even though I'm zigzagging my way there. And also another thing that is important to know is that you could also go backwards without feeling shame. There are times when you just want to make a quilt that's simple and quick and easy, and other times that you're willing to take that extra effort and do the painstaking miniature piecing or whatever it is that you're working on that's farther ahead in line. It's actually nice for me to be balancing the two, and to make something, when I'm making something that's difficult and takes a lot of my attention, I like to make something quick and easy to help balance that out. Another thing that I've learned about quilting, it's my quilt. I'm the one who gets to make the rules about that particular quilt. If other people want to make rules about quilting, they can make their own quilt. So if I think that these colors go together, well, then they do, because it's my quilt, and that's what happens with my quilt. If I decide that this size is good enough for a quilt and I don't need to make a big bed quilt, that's fine too, because it's my quilt. I can make it whatever size I want. Even if I make a little inch quilt or a big full-size bed quilt, either way, it's my quilt. I can choose the size. And speaking of customizing, that's something that's also important to learn, is that you can customize your quilt your own way. You don't have to follow the pattern. When you make a handmade quilt, it's one of a kind. So you can choose the fabrics, the size and the layout and everything pretty much about the quilt that's to your own liking. That's one of the beauties of making handmade things, right? Is that you get to choose exactly what you want it to look like. And I think you should maximize on that, is to make it exactly the way you want to. If there's something that's nagging you about the quilt or irking you, or just, if you just have a different preference, you don't have to dislike something that's in another quilt. If you want to try a different colorway, or if you just want to try switching the colors around, the lights and the dark colors around, whatever you want to do, it's your quilt. You should make it your way. And for me, not only am I making my own quilting rules, each of my quilts have different rules that I make for them. So there are some quilts that I make very loose and casual, that have raw edges. They have exposed seams. They're actually deliberately crooked. I have a rule breaking quilt where I try to break every single quilting rule that I can. I've made jean quilts and folk art quilts where the imperfections add character to the quilts. And then there's other ones where I make sure that I'm very careful with the points and the right sizes and the measurements, and everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. And I've also tried to make formal quilts and try to fix every single error that's in it to make it as perfect as I can possibly make it. I can decide if it's supposed to be casual or fun or someplace in between. I can change my mind in the middle. It's my quilt. I can choose that. Quilts are supposed to be fun, so you should be able to make them in a way that makes it fun for you. Quilting is a fun hobby, and it needs to remain so. So if something gets stressful, maybe there's something we can change to make it more fun. Another thing is that simple quilts are just as beautiful as complex quilts. The ones that you spend a lot of time making, are not necessarily always more beautiful than the simple ones that you made. So you should never be ashamed of just making something quick and simple, because really the beauty of the quilt is not determined by the amount of time that you take making it. And that is likewise in real life, that the time that you take on making something or doing something isn't necessarily the value that it adds to your life. Sometimes just going out and looking at a sunset calmly and relaxingly actually adds so much value to your life. And personally, I don't think that the volume of the number of quilts that you make should not really be the goal, at least in my opinion. It's not a matter for me to make the most number of quilts. It's more about making the quilts that please me, the ones that make me happy. There's a limited number of quilts I'm going to be able to make in my lifetime, and I want to make sure that I'm making the ones that I think are the most beautiful. And all quilts are manageable and doable if you're willing to take the time to make them step by step. My very first quilt was a Storm at Sea. It's a very difficult quilt pattern, but I was able to make it, and because of that, I have the confidence that I can make a difficult quilt, if that's the one that I find is the most beautiful. Another thing that I've learned is that you can get a lot of things done if you just take them 15 minutes at a time. The key is to keep coming back and again every day to keep working on it. It's hard to find big long periods of time where you can have a whole weekend to work on something, or a whole week, but if you can just do a few minutes every single day, it actually adds up so quickly. It's really hard to find time in life to do everything, But I think it's very important to make the time to do the things that you really enjoy doing. Sometimes it seems like making time to do something fun and frivolous, like making a quilt. It makes it seem like I'm not prioritizing my time right. I have to make money, go grocery shopping, cook, clean, do the laundry, train the dog, do the yard work. There's so many things that compete for your time. But I've learned that I should choose my priorities and take the time to do the things that make life enjoyable. It relieves pressure, adds beauty to my day. It also keeps me mentally challenged as I do the quilt math and make design decisions. Another thing that it's taught me is endurance and persistence. It takes a long time to make a quilt, and there's always something that goes wrong in the middle of the sewing. Either the bobbin runs out of thread, or the sewing machine needle breaks, or there's so many different ways that something could go wrong. And it takes a long time to make a quilt, and sometimes I can't spare more than 15 minutes in order to be able to make a quilt a day, especially when I'm working. But I've learned that it's completely possible to make a whole quilt, even a bed-size one, in just 15 minutes a day. As long as I keep coming back to it again and again, I'm able to finish the quilt. Some days only a little bit gets done. Other days things just fly perfectly. I'm able to get a lot done. And the more you do, the process gets simpler and simpler, and faster and easier. You get in the rhythm, and there's less decision making to do. And as you go along, sewing elements of a quilt block is slow at the beginning and cutting all the little tiny pieces, but once you start sewing the blocks together and then sewing the whole border on the quilt, it just gets faster and faster as you get farther on that path. And the same thing happens in other things in my life, like money management. At the beginning, it's a very slow process, but over time it compounds. The efforts that you made just get faster. Exercises like that too. It's, that first trial to get started is hard, but once you get started, then the momentum builds, and that's just easier to continue doing something, and it just gets easier over time. I'm also learning to speak more confidently to you, and I feel like, the more practice that I have, the easier it becomes, the more confidence I have, which makes it easier, and again, that also compounds over time. I've also learned about motivation and inertia. Sometimes if you have a quilt in a drawer, it just sits there for a long time, ignored for a long time. When the quilt is unfinished in the box, it's easier to just let it sit there, and inertia just takes over. But when I open up the box and I start touching the fabrics and looking at the pattern, when you finally take it out of the box, that's actually, you have more motivation to work on it, and that motivation builds. I get more and more excited about making the quilt once I just start on it. And it gets me motivated to work on it more. And working on that unfinished quilt, getting that finished actually motivates me more to get some other unfinished quilts finished. It's really exponential growth again, that, once you start doing something and you find out that it's not as bad as you thought it was, then it just makes it easier to take the next step and the next step. Another thing that I've found is that even though my friends and family aren't interested in making quilts, they are very interested in looking at them and seeing them. And I get a lot of support from my friends and family and coworkers on this YouTube channel, and they really enjoy watching my quilts as art pieces or as just things that I've made. And it's really fun to see the reaction of quilts from non-quilters' perspective, because there's lessons learned in that as well. I'm curious to know what you think. What have you learned from quilting? What kind of life lessons have you gotten from your quilting, or quilting lessons have you gotten? If you enjoyed this video, I hope you give it a thumbs up. I think that you may be interested in this other video that I've made. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of your support, and I'll see you in the next video.